The basement door was locked, and Elena's phone was destroyed. But the voice recorder in her work bag was still recording. Above her head, through the kitchen ceiling, she heard her mother's voice. "We needed a fall guy, Elena." 13 hours earlier, the day had begun like any other Sunday. Elena sat at her mother's circular oak table, her hands gripped so tightly around a white porcelain teacup with gold trim that her knuckles had turned white. The lace tablecloth beneath the cup was the same one Lydia had used for 20 years. Pristine, never stained, never wrinkled. The plate of half-eaten crepes sat untouched in front of Elena, steam still rising from the stack of delicate pastries. The heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway marked each second with mechanical precision, and with every tick, Elena felt her shoulders hunch a little lower. Lydia sat across from her, studying her daughter with an expression that had perfected itself over decades. A mixture of concern and disappointment that was somehow worse than outright anger. "You're barely eating, Elena," Lydia said, her voice carrying the particular sting of someone who had invested hours in a meal that would not be appreciated. "I spent 3 hours on these crepes." Elena forced a large forkful into her mouth. She didn't chew. She swallowed hard, feeling the warm crepe lodge in her throat like a stone. She smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. The silverware clicked against the porcelain as she set the fork down with deliberate care. "They're delicious, Mom. Really. Thank you for having me." The words came out strained and high-pitched, the voice of someone performing rather than speaking. Lydia reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair from Elena's face. The touch was firm, almost aggressive, pushing her head back slightly. Elena flinched. She could feel the gold rings on her mother's fingers. 3 of them, all expensive, all from jewelry stores Elena could never afford to step into. Lydia's manicured red fingernail traced down Elena's pale cheek. "You look tired," Lydia said. "Is that job of yours worth looking like a ghost?" Elena looked down at her lap. Under the table, her hands found the blue linen napkin and began to twist it into a tight rope, wrapping the fabric around her fingers until the circulation stopped. The neighborhood children were playing outside somewhere. She could hear them distantly, their voices high and carefree, free from the weight of Sunday breakfasts that felt like interrogations. "I'm just busy," Elena said quietly, keeping her eyes on the twisted napkin. "They need me there." Lydia stood up abruptly, the scrape of her chair on the linoleum floor sharp enough to make Elena's shoulders jump. She gathered the plates with a loud clatter, stacking them without care, her movements all sharp angles and repressed fury. She turned her back to Elena and faced the sink, her reflection visible in the window glass above it. "Everyone needs you," Lydia said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Except your mother, apparently." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elena untangled the napkin from her fingers and folded it carefully into a perfect square. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. When she left an hour later, Elena took the long route to her car, hoping to avoid any further conversation. But there would be no escape that day. There would be many days to come where escape seemed impossible. The supermarket parking lot was overcast and cold. Elena carried 2 brown paper grocery bags, vegetables and bread and milk, the ordinary staples of an ordinary life. Her silver sedan sat waiting for her, patient and indifferent to her troubles. She was fishing for her keys when the black SUV screeched to a halt behind her car, blocking her in completely. Elena's shoulders jumped. She stood frozen for a moment, watching as the driver's side door opened. Mark climbed out of the SUV like he was emerging from a pit. He was wearing a grease-stained gray hoodie, the kind he always wore when he wasn't trying to impress anyone, which was most of the time. He slammed his door with enough force to make the car shudder, and then he walked toward Elena with heavy, fast steps. His shadow fell over her as he approached, and she felt the old, familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came whenever Mark entered her orbit. "You didn't answer my texts, El," Mark said, his voice low and menacing. "I need that 500. His fists were clenched at his sides. His jaw was set in a way that Elena recognized, the way it looked when he was about to do something she wouldn't be able to stop. She tried to step around him to get to her car door, but he stepped directly into her path. His chest was inches from hers. Elena tried to squeeze past him, and one of the grocery bags caught on the edge of the car door. The paper ripped. A glass jar of pickles fell to the ground and shattered, sending green liquid and glass and the smell of vinegar across the asphalt. "I can't, Mark," Elena said, and her voice was trembling. "Rent is due tomorrow. Please let me go." Mark grabbed her upper arms. His fingers dug into the fabric of her coat, and for a moment, she thought he might throw her. Instead, he shoved her backward, hard, against the side of her sedan. Her head hit the window with a dull thud that made her vision blur for a moment. He leaned his weight into her, pinning her there against the cold metal and glass. "You always have money for Mom," Mark said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "Give me your purse." Elena's hands were shaking. She reached into her coat and pulled out her leather wallet. In her panic, she fumbled it, and it dropped from her fingers into the mess of pickles and broken glass below them. Mark pushed her aside roughly, and Elena stumbled backward, her body slamming into the metal shopping cart return rail with a clang that echoed through the parking lot. She gasped for air, clutching at her side where the metal edge had dug into her ribs. Mark bent down and retrieved the wallet from the wreckage. He didn't look at her as he walked back to his SUV. He just climbed inside and drove away, leaving her standing in the parking lot with a bruise already forming on her arm and one shoe still sitting in the puddle of vinegar. Elena drove home in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just drove, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. It was only when she walked into her apartment and threw her keys onto the glass coffee table that she noticed the mail that had been slid under her door. There was a stack of it, bills mostly, and some advertisements. But one envelope caught her eye immediately. It was already open. It was addressed to her in typeface, not handwriting, and the return address read, Metropolitan Trust. Elena pulled out a yellow carbon copy of a bank statement. She stood in the middle of her living room, still in her coat, and began to read. Her finger traced down the document. There was a loan listed, a large loan, $50,000, taken out by Lydia V. Miller. And at the bottom of the page, there was Elena's signature. Except it wasn't her signature. The handwriting was a crude imitation, almost mockingly bad now that she was looking at it directly. The words at the top of the page were printed in bold red text. Notice of co-signer liability. Elena whispered the words aloud. She did it again. Because there had been other times. A credit card 3 years ago that Elena had been told she was just helping with. A car loan she didn't remember signing. And now this. A $50,000 debt that the bank was now telling her she was legally responsible for. Elena sat down on her couch and stared at the yellow paper until the numbers blurred together. Monday morning came whether Elena wanted it to or not. She went to work because that's what she always did. She went to work because going to work was the only thing that made sense anymore. It was the one place where she had a function, a role, a reason to exist. She was sitting at her desk when Mr. Grayson arrived. He dropped 3 thick blue folders directly onto her keyboard without bothering to ask if she was ready, nearly hitting her fingers in the process. The folders were labeled Audit 2023 Urgent, and they hit the keyboard with a heavy thud that made Elena's entire body jump. "I need these retabulated by 5 p.m., Mr. Grayson said, his voice curt and entitled. "No excuses, Miller." Elena looked at the clock on her wall. It was 9:15 a.m. She looked back at the mountain of folders in front of her. She opened the first one and saw pages upon pages of dense spreadsheets. Numbers in tiny font, columns that stretched across multiple pages. Data so complex that it would take hours to parse even if she had nothing else to do. "But sir," Elena said quietly, her voice small and weak, "I have the quarterly reports due today too." Mr. Grayson leaned over her desk. He placed his palms flat on her desk calendar, and then he loomed over her, blocking out the light from the window. His tie dangled over her keyboard. His eyes were cold, and Elena found herself shrinking back into her chair, making herself smaller, trying to take up less space. "You're the team player, aren't you?" he said. And his voice had shifted into something manipulative, something that wasn't quite threatening, but carried the weight of threat. "Don't let the team down, Elena." Elena nodded without speaking. She turned back to her computer and opened the first spreadsheet. By noon, she had worked through half of one folder. By 3 o'clock, she had consumed 2 cups of coffee and eaten nothing. By 4:45 p.m., she was still working, her eyes burning, her back aching from leaning forward, and she still had more than half of the final folder left to complete. But Mr. Grayson didn't ask about the deadline. He had already moved on to bothering someone else. Elena left the office at 7:30 p.m. The sun was already setting. The city was beginning its evening transition into darkness, and she was too tired to do anything but make the drive home on autopilot. She exited the elevator on the 4th floor of her building and started walking toward her apartment. That's when she saw the man in the cheap brown suit standing outside her door. He was leaning against the wood, his shoulders relaxed, his posture that of someone who had decided they had nothing better to do than wait. As Elena approached, he straightened up. He was holding a clipboard. "Elena Miller?" the man said. His name was Vince, though Elena didn't know that yet. "We need to talk about the Metropolitan loan." Elena tried to push past him. She wanted to get to her door, to get her key in the lock, to get inside and close the door and pretend that this conversation wasn't happening. But Vince stepped in front of her and placed his flat hand directly over the keyhole. "Get out of my way," Elena said, and her voice was rising, hot with frustration and fear. "I didn't take that loan." "That's not what the paperwork says," Vince replied. And his tone suggested he had this conversation many times and had stopped caring about the details somewhere around the 100th repetition. Elena reached for the door again, trying to push her key past his hand. But Vince grabbed her wrist. He twisted it slightly, forcing her to drop her keys. They fell between his feet with a jingle of the small teddy bear keychain that dangled from the ring. Elena cried out. The pain shot up her arm from her wrist. She used her free hand to shove Vince in the chest. He didn't budge much, but he lost his balance enough for her to break her wrist free. She dove for the keys, her body scrambled on her knees on the carpet. Vince kicked the keys away down the hallway. They skid across the floor and came to rest near the elevator. Then he grabbed Elena by the back of her coat and hauled her up to her feet, pinning her against the wall. Her back arched and her eyes filled with tears. "Tell your mother the grace period is over," Vince said coldly. Then he released her and walked toward the elevator. Elena slumped against the wall, breathing hard. It was several minutes before she gathered the strength to crawl down the hallway to retrieve her keys. That night, Elena didn't call anyone. She didn't contact a lawyer or a police officer or even a friend. Instead, she waited until 10 p.m., and then she drove to her mother's house. She let herself in with the spare key that Lydia had made her take years ago. The house was dark and quiet. She climbed the stairs to Lydia's bedroom, moving carefully, trying not to make any noise. The bedroom was illuminated only by the street light filtering through the window. Elena went to the mahogany dresser and began rummaging through the bottom drawer. She pushed aside a pile of silk scarves and pulled out a flashlight from her pocket. The beam illuminated a small jewelry box. Inside the jewelry box was a black leather binder. Elena opened it and shined the light on the pages inside. What she saw made her breath catch. It was a statement for a Swiss bank account. The balance was listed at the top in large numbers. $2,450,000. Where? Elena heard a sound from somewhere downstairs. She froze, but it was only the house settling, the old wood creaking as it did every night. She turned the page. Behind the bank statement was a photograph. It showed Lydia and Mark standing in front of a brand new beach house in Florida. They were both holding a sold sign and smiling brightly at the camera. The date printed on the bottom corner was from last month. The binder fell from Elena's hands and hit the floor with a heavy thud. She whispered the words aloud. "She's been hiding it. They both have." Elena grabbed the binder and ran from the bedroom. She had made it down the stairs and almost to the front door when the lights in the hallway suddenly came on. Lydia stood at the top of the stairs, wearing her nightgown, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and fury. "Elena!" Lydia called out. Elena didn't wait to hear more. She ran out of the front door into the pouring rain. The rain was heavy and cold, and it fell in sheets that seemed to erase the world beyond 10 feet. Elena ran down the sidewalk, clutching the binder to her chest, her breath coming in gasps. She didn't have a plan. She just needed to be away from this house, away from her mother, away from everything that had been squeezing the life out of her for as long as she could remember. That's when she saw Mark stepping out from behind her car. He was holding a tire iron. He held it loosely at his side, like a man who had brought a tool for a specific job and was about to use it. The rain was pouring down on him, and his face was flat, dangerous, without expression. "Put the binder back, Elle," Mark said. "You weren't supposed to see that." Elena turned to run, but Mark was faster. He swung the tire iron in a wide arc, and it connected with her shoulder with a sound like a bell being struck. The pain was immediate and enormous, and she screamed and fell sideways into a deep puddle, the cold water shocking her lungs. The binder tumbled from her grip and slid across the wet asphalt, landing several feet away from her. Mark stood over her, raising the tire iron for another strike. He had it lifted above his head, his arms extended, ready to bring it down. But then a police siren wailed in the distance, getting closer. Mark hesitated for just a moment. But that moment was enough for him to decide that completing what he had started was less important than running. He didn't lower the tire iron, though. Instead, he kicked her hard in the ribs, the toe of his boot connecting with the place where she was most vulnerable. Elena curled into a ball, the air driven from her lungs. Then Mark ran back to his SUV, jumped inside, and drove away into the rain. Elena lay in the puddle for a long time. The police siren faded into the distance, heading toward some other emergency. She couldn't breathe properly. Each breath sent pain through her ribs. But she pushed herself up onto her hands and knees and crawled over to where the binder had landed. She pulled it back to herself and sat in the rain for several more minutes, just breathing. Then headlights appeared through the rain. A car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down and Lydia's face appeared. "Elena!" Lydia called out. "Get in. You'll catch pneumonia." Elena didn't think. She just stood up, limped to the car, and got inside. Warmth surrounded her immediately. The heater was running, and the interior of the car was dry. Lydia pulled away from the curb and headed toward the house. At the kitchen table, with Elena wrapped in a thick wool blanket, Lydia cleaned the cut on her forehead with a cotton ball soaked in antiseptic. Elena's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold the blanket around her shoulders. The binder sat on the kitchen counter, wet and stained with mud. "Mom," Elena said, and her voice sounded broken even to her own ears. "Mark, he hit me. He has the money. You have the money." Lydia stopped cleaning the wound. She stared at Elena with a smile that was terrifyingly calm, the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. Lydia reached into her pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They were Elena's keys. The teddy bear keychain dangled from Lydia's hand, swinging back and forth like a hypnotist's pendulum. "We needed a fall guy, Elena," Lydia said, her voice dripping with sweetness and venom in equal measure. "You're so good at making people happy. Surely you'll do this for me." Elena's body went rigid. She understood then, all at once, with the clarity of someone who had just seen the trap close around them. Lydia pushed a document across the table. It was a confession of embezzlement from Elena's company. The text was dense and full of corporate language, but the meaning was crystal clear, and at the bottom, there was a signature that looked like Elena's. Not a perfect forgery, but close enough that someone who didn't know her handwriting well might not question it. The document was dated today. "I haven't filed it yet," Lydia said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "But I will, unless you agree to take responsibility for the loan. You see, the bank is starting to ask questions about our financial situation. Mark's gotten a bit careless with how he's been spending money. And I've decided that I'd rather not deal with an audit." Elena looked at the confession. She looked at her mother's face. She understood, with horrible clarity, that there was no escape here. If she refused, Lydia would file the confession with the bank and the police. Elena would be arrested for embezzlement. She would go to prison, and Lydia and Mark would disappear to Florida with their millions, leaving behind nothing but a trail of forged documents with Elena's name on them. If she agreed, what would happen? Elena didn't know, but she knew what would happen if she refused. Lydia stood up and walked to the basement door. She opened it. "Go downstairs, Elena," Lydia said. "We need some time to figure out the details." Elena stood up on legs that didn't want to hold her weight. She walked to the basement door. The stairs descended into darkness below. She took the first step down, and the second, and the third. Behind her, she heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place, locking with a loud clack. The basement was cold and concrete, and lit by a single light bulb that hung from the ceiling on a frayed wire. Elena sat down on the floor and pressed her back against the wall. She looked at her phone. The screen was smashed from the fight in the rain, and when she tried to press the power button, only a few green lines flickered on the display before going dark again. "No, no, no," Elena whispered, tapping the screen. But there was nothing inside her phone that could be resurrected with tapping. It was dead. She was alone in the basement in the dark, and there was no one who knew where she was. It was then that Elena remembered something. In her work bag, the one she had carried with her to her mother's house without thinking about it, there was a digital voice recorder. She used it for recording work meetings. a habit she had picked up years ago when she realized that written notes weren't enough to protect herself from misquotes and misremembered conversations. Elena had grabbed the bag on her way out of the kitchen, holding it like a drowning woman might hold a piece of wood. She fumbled through the bag until her fingers closed around the small rectangular device. She turned it on. The red recording light illuminated in the darkness, casting a small ruby glow in front of her face. For the next 3 hours, Elena sat in the basement and waited. And upstairs, in the kitchen, Lydia and Mark talked about their plan. Lydia said things about needing to establish a clear timeline. Mark said things about calling the police in the morning with a report of embezzlement. And through it all, the digital voice recorder in Elena's work bag captured every word. Midnight came, and Elena stood up. She looked at the small, high ventilation window near the ceiling. It was just barely within reach if she could get high enough. She stacked 2 old wooden crates on top of a workbench, being careful to move quietly, even though she knew no one was listening. The crates groaned under her weight as she climbed onto them. She reached for the window latch, which was rusted shut from years of neglect. She pulled a metal screwdriver from the workbench and jammed it into the hinge. The metal screamed in protest as she pulled, and flakes of rust fell onto her face like red snow. The latch didn't give. Elena pulled harder, putting all of her strength into it. Her bicep muscles tensed, and her face went red with effort. And then, with a sound like bones breaking, the latch gave way. The window swung open, revealing the dark night beyond. Elena pushed herself up through the opening. Her shoulders scraped against the frame, but she didn't stop. She pulled herself up, hand over hand, until she was lying on the ground outside the basement window. She rolled onto her back and looked up at the stars. Then she got to her feet and walked around to the front of the house. The kitchen light was still on. Elena could see her mother through the window, standing by the telephone with her finger hovering over the dial for 911. Mark was leaning against the refrigerator, drinking a beer. They arrested Lydia and Mark right there in the kitchen. They read them their rights, while Elena sat wrapped in a blanket on the front porch, finally warm again. The detective who took her statement told her that the bank records she had discovered in her mother's bedroom, combined with the recorded confession, would be enough to press charges for fraud, forgery, and assault. Elena nodded. She didn't say much. She just answered the questions that were asked of her. And then the detective drove her home. The next 3 months passed in a strange, quiet blur. There was a trial, though Elena didn't have to testify. The evidence was overwhelming enough without her. Lydia was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Mark got 8. The embezzlement charges against Elena were dropped immediately once the forgery was proven. She kept her job, though she asked for a transfer to a different department. Mr. Grayson didn't ask her to stay. He just accepted the transfer request without comment. 3 months after that night in the basement, Elena was sitting on a park bench in the middle of the day. The sun was bright and warm, and the park was full of the kind of ordinary life that she had never quite managed to be a part of before. Children were playing on the grass. Joggers were running past. People sat in small groups, talking and laughing. Elena was eating a sandwich and reading a book, a hardcover book with a beautiful cover that she had bought for herself, for no reason other than the fact that she wanted to read it. The pages crinkled pleasantly as she turned them. Birds were chirping in the trees overhead. In the distance, she could hear the sound of a fountain splashing. Her phone rang in her lap. She looked at the screen. The caller ID displayed, District Penitentiary, Mark. Elena looked at the phone for a moment. She didn't answer it. She didn't feel a wave of emotion wash over her. She didn't think about Mark or her mother or the basement or any of it. She simply looked at the screen, and then she swiped the call away. Declined. The phone went silent and dark. She set it face down on the bench beside her. A child nearby dropped a toy truck on the grass, a bright red vehicle with wheels that actually turned. The child looked at it, and then looked at their parent, waiting to see what would happen. The parent got up and walked over to pick it up. Elena watched this happen. She didn't jump up. She didn't rush over to help. She didn't insert herself into someone else's problem. She just watched. And then she returned her attention to her book. She took a deep breath of the fresh, clear air. She could taste the salt from the fountain. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her face. And she turned the page.